Sorry, I always forget to record our class.
Sorry,
Go ahead, Juliana.
would that MRI brief therapist assume that the behavior that perpetuates in this client is actually caused and determined by other people's behavior?
It's influenced, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So with both of these approaches, the focus can be on, so the thought is each individual part, if changed, inherently creates change in the whole system. So you can focus on it like a problematic interaction, and the entire system will have to adjust to that change. So let's go ahead and, ooh, where am I? Here we go. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this all, well, I'll expand it here. So the types of change, just so to reiterate, again, the goal isn't necessarily second order change. It is the appropriate level of change to decrease distress or to change perception on the distress. So here, an example of first order change is when roles might change, but the dynamic remains unchanged. So let's say we have kind of the classic pursuer withdrawer. And if somebody, let's say the withdrawer decides to pursue, and if the other person, so if they just swap roles, nothing has really changed because the dynamic remains unchanged. If they both pursue or the interaction changes to the point where the structure and the rules change, then that's second order change. So here you can see like the level of intimacy, if they swap roles, remains unchanged. Therefore, it is simply a first order change. So then with second order, again, the kind of definition here is it there's a change that fundamentally changes the structure, forcing new rules for relating within the system. So the internal order of the system is changed. And again, this may be the amount of change or level of change that is necessary for problems to be resolved, but that's not always the case. And in order to track either one of these, you would want to do a week by week assessment just to see, again, what the perceptions are, what the behaviors are, how are these working? Because in both of these approaches, you are looking in session. Your job is to elucidate the process. So you're highlighting what's actually happening. And then the change, the behavioral prescription that you are giving the family or the system is done outside of session. And then you come back and process how that change was. So Marcy, here is where we'll cover your questions. So please let me know if you have anything additional. So 3 ways to mishandle difficulties, essentially the 3 ways that families will come to you saying that they've attempted solutions and they're still experiencing distress is first, what are considered terrible simplifications. So there's a solution that's attempted by denying that a problem is a problem. So action is necessary, but none is taken. This potentially could apply to Justine, the example that you gave on maybe the way to deal with somebody with a substance use disorder is to like pretend that it's not a problem. So second, the utopian syndrome. So this is when change is attempted regarding a difficulty, which for all practical purposes is unchangeable. So you're trying to, for example, change a generation gap. It is a like immutable characteristic that can't be changed. So action is taken when it shouldn't be. So I guess it could be kind of the quintessential like banging your head against a wall where there's something that just can't be changed, but you're trying to control something that you have no control over. And then the paradox, which is an error in logical typing, is committed in, and a game without end, so just another term within both MRI and Milan, is established. It may occur by attempting a first order change in a situation, which can only be changed by a second order change or a higher logical level, or the reverse, where a first order change would be totally sufficient and you're trying to use a second order change. So this is action taken at the wrong level. So Marcy or anyone else, questions about that? So these are all known as more of the same solutions, which is fundamentally different from what MRI or Milan prescribe. So any questions about these three ways of mishandling difficulties?
Yeah, no, I guess my question was more about what are the solutions to these problems? What is the clinically appropriate way of going in and addressing each of these?
Yeah, so from like an MRI or Milan perspective, I'm going to take a stab at these. So please, if anybody else has any other ideas, please feel free to chime in. So with the utopian syndrome, that would be where Milan or an MRI therapist would want to help change in perspective. So again, like a generation gap can't be closed. So there would be a working toward an acceptance of its existence. Like, so you're not taking action, you're not spinning your wheels where no change can occur. And then with the paradox, you would be assessing the level of change that is necessary, likely doing some psychoeducation with the family or the system or prescribing different behavioral interactions at the appropriate level. So if it's simply a first order change that's needed, you're going to do something a little bit more, I don't know, not necessarily short term, but that will just change an interaction as opposed to changing how the individuals relate to one another.
And may I ask, did they identify criteria for determining which level of change is most appropriate?
There's not necessarily criteria. That would be something that would be co-constructed and assessed on a weekly basis with the system. How is this working? How is your level of distress? How is the presenting problem affecting you?
So try first order, and if that doesn't work, you move to the second order?
Yeah, so in many cases, first order change precedes second order change. So if attempts at first order change continually do not work, then you would want to go to the next logical level, which is second order change.
Sarah, could you give a simple example of a paradox where a clinician is attempting a second order change when a first order change would be appropriate?
Great question.
That's how I learn. I need to, if I can have some examples, it would make more sense to me. Simple examples.
Sure. I'll pitch that while I think. I'm going to pitch that to the class too. Does an example come to anybody's mind?
Or vice versa. I'm trying to do a first order change when a second order change would be appropriate.
So that one more easily comes to mind for me, where I think I may have given this example in an earlier class, but okay, so let's say that there's a student. So it's we'll say a family of three, two parents and a child. That child is in school, having difficulties completing homework and struggling in school. So a first order change would be providing tutoring. So that would be just allowing the child more time to focus on their school, whereas a second order, or so potentially some of the reason for the child having difficulty in school is distress at home, lack of sleep, things like that. They're really responding to potentially parental distress or volatility. So second order change would be fundamentally changing how the parents interact with one another. And then you would see symptom reduction from the child. Or
So that's
distress
easy to
reduction.
understand. I guess, yeah, it would be the other one that I'm kind of like, what would be an example of that?
So,
I don't-
potentially, go ahead, if, was somebody else talking? Sorry, I can't.
I
I
was,
think,
oh,
I think I might have one, but I
Okay.
could be wrong too. So I think an example could be like, if a couple is having problems and the main argument from the wife is that my husband is not spending enough time with me, instead of trying to change the interaction, like on a deeper level of how they interact, the therapist might just prescribe like, okay, you have to go out 3 times a week in
Mhm.
order to relieve or make the distress not as bad. So it's like, it's not, if that can fix the problem, then
Mhm.
why go to level 2?
Mhm.
Is that wrong?
Nope, that's accurate.
well, but I was thinking too, that if a level 2 change is a change of the rules in
Right,
some respect,
right.
then you might have a problem where people in the family are not following some perfectly good rules.
Mm,
So maybe one of the rules is, for this example, we're going to have a date night once a week, but we're not doing that. So then we want to get them to follow their rules and perhaps find out what is getting in the way of following this perfectly reasonable and helpful procedure, this
Mm.
rule.
And to
Yes.
do that from this perspective is understanding that process through circular questioning and the communication patterns. If I'm following with you, George.
Yeah, but
Okay.
here's the thing, I was bothered by the dot problem.
Okay.
Because it strikes me that, it's not just thinking outside the box.
Mhm.
Where's the box coming from? People are
Right.
making assumptions
Yep,
on the basis of a number of things,
yep.
which may be perfectly supportable in
Mhm.
their world of experience, cultural context, and so forth. And so they are following a larger set of rules, perhaps,
Okay.
even though it's not explicitly stated in
Right.
the instructions to this particular problem. So it's kind of sneaky and tricky. And when you see it, you go, oh, well, if I'd known that, I could have solved it in a heartbeat. Maybe the
Right.
people who are having problems with the rules in their lives are following this larger set of things. What is it to be a good person, a good husband, a good son, whatever it is? It's never been explicitly stated.
Sure.
Maybe it's not even expected by the
Okay.
others in the
Yep.
system.
Yep.
And yet one has reason to believe that these are good things. So,
Mhm.
we're following these rules. And maybe when therapists run into resistance, as it said, what we're really hitting is people just trying to, be a good person and follow their rules.
Yeah, so from these perspectives, from these approaches, we would do what you would do in that case is make explicit all of those assumptions. So one of the beliefs within these approaches is that there are these expectations or these rules that are unspoken or assumed, and there's not consensus about that. So one of the approaches with this would be, let's make these more explicit. Let's talk about these things. And then also sometimes when there is this feeling of stuckness, sometimes what you have to do is throw in something a little bit unexpected, and that can change the meaning of the interactions or change the perception of the interactions to the point where that stuckness can no longer exist because how you look at it now is different. So it won't have the same effect anymore because of the intervention that was used. And I'll if that sounds abstract, I promise that I'll give some more solid examples of that.
I have a question though, within this theory,
Mhm.
is it more so the therapist being directive in terms of the solutions that are not working, or is the therapist trying to guide the family towards
Yeah.
finding their own alternative solutions?
Yeah, so there's two terms that are used in, I would argue MRI is more directive than Milan. Milan is more, so we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the therapist will take on essentially two roles. So that's what the concepts of maneuverability and things like that are. But there's like a role of a hunter and the role of a breeder. The role of a hunter is much more directive than the role of the breeder. And so with Milan, for example, circular questioning is very non-directive, very, kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of like soft, meaning like not challenging, like not this direct challenge, but it does challenge like why things are existing. So I don't know if I'm fully answering your question, Justine, but I would say MRI more directive, Milan more, it's not even necessarily collaborative, but it's a little bit more of a investigative role for the family to come to some solution. So I guess you could kind of liken it a bit to some MI. Does that answer your question? Okay, so just to highlight this, I wanted to, because again, both MRI and Milan are very focused on interactional patterns. MRI is more focused on behavioral patterns, and Milan is more focused on language and meaning making, because Milan was a lot more influenced by the postmodernism and narrative approaches. So I wanted to share with you, though, before I get into either of them, specifically what one thing is that they share. Okay. Ooh. Sorry, my stuff's going slow. Okay, here we go.
Having a Rent the Runway subscription has opened up a world of possibilities for me. My body has changed, and the things I used.
Hello, everybody. Today we will be talking about the communication process. It's a fairly simple, basic component process. You have the sender, one who uses verbal and nonverbal means to initiate communication. They have a message, the verbal or nonverbal expression of a sender's purpose. And there's a receiver, the target of the sender's communication. They can be a listener, an observer, or both. But what's wrong with this model? We have a sender, a message, and a receiver. The problem is we don't often communicate in such a unidirectional manner, a one-way version of communication. A more complete picture looks something like this. We have a sender, but they pick up the dual role of receiver as well. And we'll get back to that in a second. So as a sender, they send their message, as in the more simple version of the model, and they send it to a receiver. But you'll notice here that the receiver has also picked up a secondary role. They are a sender as well. What do they send? They send feedback. Feedback is the response of the receiver to the sender's message, which tells the sender how the message was received. Gets back to the sender, as we said. So to illustrate this a little bit, imagine the sender receiver says hello, the message hello, to the receiver sender. Receiver sender can provide feedback, a smile, a verbal answer of hello as well. And the sender receiver knows that their original hello message was received correctly. Now, it's not always that simple, and it doesn't always work as smoothly. There's more to the process. The sender needs to encode their message. The sender receiver encodes their message, and the receiver sender encodes their feedback. When I choose to say hello or smile, I need to encode it in such a way that it is very likely it will be received correctly. Also, though, on the receiver end, the sender receiver and the receiver sender as well, they need to be able to code that message correctly as well. So you may be asking, what is encoding and decoding? Encoding is the sender's selection of the means of expression. How do I shape that smile? What kind of tone do I put into my hello? Right? Those are the ways I encode. Decoding is how the receiver gives meaning to the message through their own perception. Now, decoding can be pretty simple, but some things can get in the way. They can get in the way of encoding and decoding, but decoding is the one that can be hit the hardest. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about interference. Interference is anything that disrupts or prevents a receiver's interpretation of a sender's message as the sender intended it. So maybe I'm not feeling very well today and my smile doesn't quite form the way I want it to. Maybe I unintentionally color my hello with what the receiver decodes as sarcasm so that they think I'm not glad to see them. They'll feed back with maybe a puzzled expression, right? And I'll get that message and understand that feedback message and understand that I maybe need to reiterate my message to ensure proper communication. Again, it gets even a little more complicated if we add in the idea of context. Context brings in even more potential interference. Context is the physical, social, psychological, and time elements in which the communication takes place. How can this affect the message? Well, if a person has just had a bad day and I come in and I say hello, they might not be in the best place physically, psychologically, or socially to receive my message in the way I intended. That is the basic communication process, folks. For our test that'll be coming up after this, you will be expected.
There's no test. Not from me, at least. Okay, so I just wanted to explicitly share that with you in the assessment piece of both MRI and Milan. So then we won't do this right now, but I just wanted to introduce to you this case study where after we learn specifically about MRI and Milan, we'll be going into breakout rooms and conceptualizing each of these cases from each perspective. So just seeing its application on the same case and how you may work with them a little bit differently. So I just wanted to introduce to you the case study. So MRI systemic therapy. So in terms of the evolution or creation, the genesis of these two approaches, MRI systemic therapy existed first, and Milan was one of the offshoots of MRI. So all of the creators of the Milan approach all studied at the Mental Research Institute. So quick overview before we get into some of the more nuts and bolts of this is MRI conceptualizes symptoms of individuals within the larger network of family and social systems. So MRI is essentially considered the original systemic approach. So what you will see when we cover this is how many similarities really all of the approaches have that we'll be covering in this class. They're essentially an offshoot of MRI. And therapists tap into systemic dynamics to affect change. So again, it's like the briefest of brief approaches where as soon as there is symptom or distress reduction, it's over. So as the therapist, you will introduce these small yet meaningful alterations into the family interactions and see how that affects change. And if it affects change to the point where a perception has changed or the behavior has changed, you've done your job. And so when you are kind of disrupting, perturbing these systems at our families, you are allowing for the family, because of the way that you approach the family, which I'll talk about that, how we conceptualize families, you are assuming that they are going to naturally reorganize by the way that you view them. So I'm going to perturb it, and my assumption is that whatever way that they attend to the challenge or being perturbed is going to be more helpful than the way they've been attempting thus far. So this was started by Milton Erickson. We'll watch a little video of him to get a little context with him. So again, one of the original systemic approaches, and our field is still very young, about 70 years old. So what Erickson did was focused on change and idiosyncratic problem solving. So not personality or ideology. So again, very true to systemic approaches where we're not looking at individual pathology or necessarily these intrapersonal characteristics. We're looking at how people relate to one another. And that's where we conceptualize that the issue lies. Any sort of symptomology, like individual symptomology that you may see, is a form of communication. And so our job is to foster new beliefs in personal resources and personal flexibility. So again, when a family has tried and attempted to fix the presenting issue, there's a sense of rigidity in that, of like, kind of white knuckling or strong holding onto this approach. And also believing we've tried everything. I'm sure that you've had clients come to you and say, this is our kind of a last ditch effort to fix this. And also we're not, anyway, I'll talk about it a little later, but with Milana and MRI, we're not in the business of fixing things either. So our work is in indirect suggestions, trance induction, and binds. So I will define all of those for you. But first, let's listen to Dr. Erickson. And this is a really good example of a behavioral prescription that is very unique. It's something that likely, I don't know, maybe we would have thought of it, but a very unique way of looking at an issue. Man, my internet is just hurting my feelings today. What is happening? Sorry, guys.
The following is an excerpt from Disc 3, Story 3, Volume 1 of In the Room with Milton H. Erickson, MD. To purchase these DVDs, please go to miltonericksondvds.com. Thank you.
Now, another example of short-term therapy. It isn't so much what the therapist does as what he gets his patient to do. It crossed me in mind, Sami said, his mother and sister and her sister lived in Milwaukee. Both were independently wealthy, and his aunt had a great big home, a great big yard, 52 years old, unmarried, totally friendless. He went to church. Regularly, he said by herself. He didn't speak to the Episcopalian minister. He didn't speak to any of the parishioners. And he went to church on every possible occasion. He had a housekeeper and a maid who came in each morning, did the housework, prepared the meals, washed the dishes, And then an evening left. Housekeeper bought supplies, paid the yard man, and keep the yard looking beautiful. And that woman lived alone in a great big house. And my classmate told me my aunt had been profoundly depressed for 9 months. Housekeeper's worried about her. So is the maid. She and my mother won't speak to each other. He has no friends and just goes to church. She likes me. She can't stand too frequent visits from me. Once a year is about all she can take. And I'm worried about her. Now, on your lecture trips to Milwaukee, you look her up and see if you can do anything for her. One evening, I rapped at her door. Housekeeper maid long departed. I identified myself and demanded that I be given a tour of the house. And she passively agreed. I went from one room to another, inspecting, hoping I'd find something and I could use. And in the sunroom, I saw 3 African violets in full bloom, different colors. And in the 4th spot, I saw she had planted a leaf. The African violets are propagated by planting leaves. And here this depressed woman passively walking through the house, showing it room by room to the stranger. He didn't care about it at all. I saw 3 adult African violets and the 3rd one being sprouted. I said, Madam, in accord with your son's wishes, I'm going to write some prescriptions for you. And I want them carried out. You give these prescriptions to your housekeeper tomorrow morning. Have her carry them out. I prescribed them, and the housekeeper buy her an adult African violet of every hue that she did not own. I think at that time there were 13 different hues. And then she would buy 50 potting pots and a supply of soil from the nursery so she could plant some more African violet leaves and start growing African violets. And I also asked the housekeeper buy 200 gifted flower pots. And my orders were every time a baby was born to a member of the church, he sent the baby an adult African violet. Every time a baby got christened, she'd send an adult African violet. Every time a church member got sick, that member got an adult African violet. Every time a girl announced her engagement, she got an African violet. Every couple that's married in church got an African ballot. And every church bazaar should contribute 12 to 20 African ballots to be sold. Every possible opportunity she was to give an African ballot. At one time, I know she had over 200 adult African ballots. Now, I was thinking she had really accomplished something. We kept a single African ballot plant alive and full bloom for 3 years. And they are the tenderest plants, and they will die. The faintest excuse. Light has to be just right. The amount of water given them just right. And taking care of 200 or more African ballots in a day's work, it doesn't give you a chance to shed a tear. You're busy early morning to late at night. And so, some 20 years later, he died of natural causes. With an endless number of friends, the African ballot queen of Milwaukee. Just one seeing just one place where he still had energy, and then capitalizing on that energy and spreading it over everything. And you can't give a beautiful African ballot to people rousing and a good feeling toward you. We had plenty of friends of all ages. And the church's Christmas party, there were always African ballots. The old, young, the sick, the well, newly born, newly christened, newly married. It was a wonderful outlet for her. And she really didn't have time to feel depressed. I saw her only once. Psychotherapy is treating a patient as an individual who is unique and never be a duplicate of that person. And you use the uniqueness of that person. That person possesses a lot of unknown qualities. I discovered she liked African ballots.
All right, before we take our first break, any thoughts, reactions to
The
Dr.
following is
Erickson?
an excerpt from Disc 3,
Oh,
Story
sorry.
4 of In the Room
Still
with
me,
Milton
still me.
H. Erickson, MD.
Sorry, y'all. Okay, now we can. Thoughts, reactions.
So he truly did one first order change directly onto her and spinned it a second, but then it got real systemic within the entire community. And one action was like a domino effect.
Mhm.
It really helped just being attentive to her surroundings. He wanted to just find something, one thing that she liked. And she liked that one thing. She might have liked a lot of other things, but he decided to go with that. Beautiful. Loved it.
Yeah, it's an example of first order change preceding second order change. And the prescription was a first order change with the foresight that it would likely result in some second order change, or the hope was that that's the direction that it was going to take.
It also strikes me as an example of working with the client's strengths.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's that idiosyncratic view of individuals and systems. Anything else?
No, I sometimes have a difficult time with when we strictly just prescribe behavioral interventions to our clients. And I think that when we do that, it really needs to be quite intentional and thoughtful. And I felt like he did a good example of when that's an appropriate use to do that. I do have concerns still about, he did say, she never would have time to be depressed. And for me, that bothers me a little bit, to be honest, because I feel like you're not really getting to take care of yourself. You're taking care of others, at the eventual, and then other people will give you love back, right? So the question that I have about is, there's second order change for the community, right? That second order change that happens to her, it seems like it's from love from the community, but rather not being able to learn about, some kind of like real introspection or insight or not, or being able to work through that for herself. So that's just my own kind of reaction to that. But it really, to me, we're talking a lot about first order, second order change. But it kind of reminds me a lot of just like, behavioral therapy can happen without insight. And this is kind of one of those examples. I do like Erickson. And I do find that he has this really good balance of showing how he can really deeply honor somebody. I love how he talked about, finding the uniqueness. You can never have another duplicate of this human being in this world. I love those. I love that. That was beautiful. So I just kind of wanted to share some of my thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you, Jocelyn. So what I'm hearing is perhaps how you're viewing this intervention wasn't necessarily self-care. Like you were saying it as like serving the community, but not necessarily certain how it was serving her.
I think the initial impact to me is that it does not serve her, but it ends up serving her in the way that she might feel love from the community. It didn't for me. If I were to be the individual myself, I think it would be a nice distraction, right? But then I would question it at the end of my life, maybe. Did I ever really get to process what was going on for that? And maybe by then it didn't matter. Maybe by then it wouldn't matter to me because I would have felt the love from my community or whatnot, right? But still, I think there's a bit of a trade-off there in doing, and I get what he had one chance to visit this person, right? So there was also not the luxury of being able to visit this person on a more regular basis. So I do find that this is a great example of still having some kind of a lasting impact. It may just not have been, I wonder, the kind of impact too that may have kind of delved a little bit deeply into her own system, her own system.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing from you, Jocelyn, is forming a formulation of your own theory of change and your own theory of therapy and the limitations of this approach.
Thank you. Thank you for putting it that way. I didn't think of that. Yeah, something for me to think about.
Of course.
May I say, I don't think there was no insight in this process, but I think the insight was Erickson's. He had a great deal of insight and probably an uncommon amount of luck too. Because how many times have we all suggested a behavioral intervention that people say, yeah, well, I didn't do it. He was a master hypnotist. Who knows, did he present his prescription with some sort of suggestion of a hypnotic nature that he is not reporting as he tells the story? I don't know. He was a one-of-a-kind character for sure.
Absolutely.
Can you imagine one of us showing up at a stranger's door would get arrested. I would anyway. I know that, you know.
I wouldn't have even been able to identify an African violet, so I'd be limited in that way immediately.
Well, there you go. But again, deep insight, I think, on
Yeah.
his part. So question for me is, how much of the client's work do we have to end up doing if we go this route?
Of
I-
applying, oh, go ahead.
I think something that came up for me that's not to do with this theory, but still came up is the battle for structure versus battle for initiative in
Mm,
terms of like, I understand what he was doing, but at the same time, as George posed, like, what was it about that intervention that drove the initiative of the client versus how did the therapist or even Erickson manage to structure this in a way which was able to get him the outcome that he wanted?
Yeah, so the why isn't the question that MRI or Milan therapists venture to answer. And George, to the your question, it's an interesting question, because as I'm pondering it, I'm thinking of, so as experts in this, as professionals in this, we have the insight of understanding how systems work. And like, so that's a given. And in terms of because we are tossing around this term insight of like, so what is the importance of that? So it's what potentially what I'm like maybe reading between the lines is that there's some level of insight that's necessary for sustainability of the changes. Like, am I anywhere near where we're kind of focusing on insight?
What will be helpful? Insight, he put his finger right on it. He went through the house looking for it. Probably as they went through the house, he was developing his relationship with this woman so that she would be primed to follow his suggestions. And he's thinking about what are the elements of depression. He's seeing a lot of isolation. He
Yep.
heard that from the son. Not many interests.
Mhm.
He finds the interest and he concocts this scheme to use the interests to get the woman socially connected
Mhm.
in good ways,
Mhm.
ways in which she'll be appreciated.
Yeah.
Those are his insights.
Yep.
Is that in a larger framework, systems, what connects with what and what are the rules going to be and how will this individual slot into that?
Hmm.
Maybe.
Sure.
I don't know that he really thought of it that way, though. I think that it was the people who followed him and tried to figure out what he was doing
Yeah.
and then borrowed these ideas coming over from cybernetics to say, oh, well, maybe this is what Milton's doing.
Yep.
Let's see if we can apply this.
Yeah. And you see,
And we don't need to know the why. We just need to know the wherefore.
Yep. And so you see that hypothesizing that you're alluding to, George, that's very present in the Milan approach. So
Yeah.
that is something that was taken, and the willingness to abandon a hypothesis if it's not working for the family. This one happened to work. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break and come back together at 3:21. All right, everyone, let's come back. So let's keep rocking with the practice and theory. So, basic premises of the MRI approach. So MRI theorists really honored the idea of second order cybernetics. So the idea that the mere presence of the therapist in the system affected the system. And this was later more highlighted in Milan, but just the idea of, this social constructivism of, I am, as a therapist, I'm not a blank slate. I am going into this system with my own belief systems, with my own, perspective. And that isn't inherently going to affect the way in which I conceptualize and assess and see what I see. So here, just saying that the nature of problems and treatment will strongly influence the kind of data that we collect and that we pay attention to, and who we're willing to see in treatment. Largely MRI therapists wanted everybody, whereas Milan therapists ended up more focused on kind of that, hearkening back to structural, that executive subsystem and whoever had membership in that system. And so what you say and what you do as a therapist, and equally what you choose or what you don't say or do. So how you evaluate the results is affected simply by you. So just the awareness of how we affect the system, how our presence affects the system. And you'll see how that was kind of not necessarily mitigated, but how that was countered in a way. So another premise of MRI is that we cannot not communicate. So even if we don't say anything, we are sending a message, and we cannot not theorize about what things may mean or others' intentions or things like that. So we have general ideas which form the context for and guide us in how we think and behave. So just again, what Dr. Erickson said about the uniqueness of us and how our lived experiences, how all of the things that make us who we are inform how we navigate the world. So this is where, this conventional MRI and systems were, they were kind of a answer to that more like psychodynamic approach, where there's a very intrapersonal focus with the theories. So this, of course, expanding it to more of an interpersonal approach. So it was in a way rejecting, or at least moving away from this idea that insight was a cure to whatever struggles or ailments or distress presenting issues that we had. So there was a moving away from that basic premise of knowledge will make one free. So MRI also sees problems as consisting of undesired behavior in the present, and again, attached little importance to any underlying factors in the past or the depth of the client's mind, patient, I guess, depending on what setting you're in. So again, there is an issue in the way people are interacting. There's distress and undesirable behavior that is happening. Let's change that. That's the focus. So all behaviors, normal or problematic, are continually being shaped and maintained or changed by ongoing reinforcements in that system and the social interaction. So whatever we're doing, it's a systemic contribution of why that's being maintained. So people's attempted solutions, the very ways they're trying to alter the problem, contribute most to the problem's maintenance or its exacerbation. So again, the kind of change, we're the change agent in terms of how, these prescriptions and being very directive in the MRI approach. But we're focusing on these attempted solutions, and we are conceptualizing these attempted solutions as the exact reason why the problem exists. So again, conventional wisdom says, if at first you don't succeed, try again. What MRI therapists say is, at first you don't succeed, maybe try a second time, but if that doesn't work, then do something different. And so in this model, we are the active agents of change, and we must consider what the most strategic change in the solution. So again, these attempted solutions, that's where these behavioral prescriptions come from, might be, and take steps to instigate changes, meaning different solutions, different attempted solutions. Even if likely the system is very committed to those attempted solutions and really believes that those are the way that they're going to move through this distress. Okay, so our role in session is to elucidate and make the process overt. So we're understanding behavioral sequences, we're asking lots of different questions about the process, and then based on what we gather, we are creating interventions, these behavioral changes for the system to implement outside of therapy. And then when they come back the next week, or however frequently that you're seeing them, that's when you basically troubleshoot the attempt, the experiment, and then we try something else. So as the therapist, we are responsible, sorry, that should say for changing, not got changing. For changing the client's response to a distressing situation. So to do this, okay, so I want you to not necessarily think of this in terms of manipulate as like tricking. I mean, in some ways with some of the paradoxical interventions it can be, but manipulate just really means like get your hands in there and like change it. So we are going to do this through changing the person, so that perception, the situation, the interaction, or potentially both of those things. So we do this on two levels. The overt level, so we are seeking compliance to task assignments. We're using all the tools we have. These are family members, teachers, employees, other larger system entities, I guess, and even the natural resistance to change. So that is an assumption of really all systemic approaches, is that systems are set up for homeostasis, right? The system doesn't want to change. So we're seeking compliance to those in these assignments, and getting the clients to buy into us as the directive. And then on the covert level, this is where we are continuously changing our clients' perspectives. So we're using like ideas rather than events. And we're also using the technique of reframing, and I'll define that through MRI's definition in a few slides. So we are shifting the client's frame of reference about the problem and subtly encouraging new ways to address the problem. So we do that through, again, this is a little bit more Milan, but changing the meaning of the interaction or of the behavior. So with the therapeutic relationship, so again, this is where what I alluded to earlier about the like disturbing or perturbing the system and then believing that it will self-correct. And the reason that the belief is there is that we respect and trust the system. We believe that the system has the tools to, like, once implementing our techniques or our interventions, that it has the ability to make a different choice that will be more beneficial to the system and will decrease stress or decrease distress and decrease the like problematic or symptomatic behavior. So we're also going in there and adapting ourselves to client language and viewpoint. So again, hearkening back to the structural approach of things like mimesis, but we're really taking on the perspective of the family, because even though we have like expertise in systems and understanding family dynamics, we have to do what's relevant for the family. And if something that we continue to like prescribe is consistently being rejected, we have to believe that that's on us and not on the system. That's from the perspective of MRI. And then practicing maneuverability, which basically means being willing to take an expert role if that's so it's basically molding ourselves to what's ever necessary for the system. So if you are working with a family that really needs strong directives and really needs to look at you as an expert and, as the doctor or something like that, that you step into that role. You may also need to take kind of a one down position and allow for yourself to be led by the system, because that will increase buy-in, increase engagement. So you're really reading the system and what it needs from you in order to ultimately change. So with MRI, there's the concept of meta communication. So this is communication about communication. So it's a lot having to do with a lot of the non-verbals that happen when we communicate with one another. So we're attending to the command aspect of the conversation, which is the process. How are people interacting? What is happening? And so there's the command aspect, and then there's the report aspect, which is the content. We are virtually uninterested in the content. We're really looking, even as the family is telling us a story and they're doing a behavioral sequence, we don't care if it was about the dishes or about a trip. That's irrelevant. We're looking at how they're interacting with one another, who is speaking when, what is the tonation or the intonation. We're looking at all of that meta communication that's happening. We're not interested in the content. So again, nonverbal clues to interpret any of the verbal messages. So, is somebody crossing their arms when one person is speaking? Is their eye rolling? Is there looking away? What's the engagement in that? And then the way that people talk to one another. So again, the tone of voice, those types of things, that can be a comment on the relationship. Meaning, so if every time my sibling talks to me that I respond to them with, I don't know, a like frustrated tone or something like that, or a mimic or mocking tone, that's maybe a way of me trying to assert dominance over that person. So you're just looking at those context clues and not necessarily what they're saying, how they're saying it. So different forms of meta communication, again, like I said, voice, tone of voice, gestures, eye glances, smirks. And then, so the way we say something and what we're saying when they match. So if I say, "It is so nice to see you," that's considered a congruent verbal message. So my nonverbals reinforce my verbal message. If I say, "It is so nice to see you," that might be would be considered satirical or openly contradicting, or I'm rolling my eyes and I'm scoffing at you as I say something that you're like, what? There's this confusion about it. And then one of the main presenting issues that are focused on is what's considered the double bind. So it's this contradiction that can't really directly be commented on. There's it's a no-win situation. So one of the examples that's pretty classically used with this is like a parent that is their child is coming to them and they're like very stiff, and the child hugs them and they say, "You never show me affection." And then the kid's like, "What? I just hugged you. What do you do?" So it's this no-win situation that if you were to comment on it, it wouldn't change anything about the situation, and the confusion stays. So it's this very contradicting statement. And so essentially double bind, it's a dilemma in communication in which an individual or group receives two or more conflicting messages, with one message negating the other. A situation in which successfully responding to one message means failing with the other and vice versa, so that the person will automatically be put in the wrong regardless of their response. So a really classic example of this is when one partner says to the other partner, be spontaneous. So if they are spontaneous, it wasn't on their own volition, so they lose. But if they don't, if they're not spontaneous, that means they don't care. So it's a no-win situation. So these can be stated explicitly, or they may be implicit with the context of the situation or conveyed by tone of voice or body language. So again, that's where we're focusing on kind of all levels of communication. So when we are assessing through an MRI lens, we are again looking at the problematic or the problem in the interactional pattern or cycle. So I am using this lens so you guys can see my cursor. So you have what's considered, again, idiosyncratically normal. So again, you are coming into the system going like, there are underlying tools and underlying strengths that this system has. I'm going to help bring out some of those things through the type of questioning that I give, again, through the perturbing. I'm assuming that perturbing, disturbing, instigating, whatever verb you want to put on it, the system will result in like a better outcome, or at least a better process for the family. So whatever homeostasis or normal is, as MRI and both Milan therapists, we don't come in and say, this is what you need to do. We don't have an a priori hypothesis about what will work. What we're seeing, and that's where we're very problem focused. We see where the problem is, and and our job is to look at what has been the attempted solutions. That's the problem. Let's change the attempted solution. Therefore, then the problem, in theory, will no longer exist. So we have this normal homeostasis, and then essentially what happens is tension rises. We have this early positive feedback, meaning that people are trying to do something to instigate change. And so they may be prepping for something. So remember, positive feedback is encouraging change. And then the symptom happens, and then we are kind of scrambling to do something that we think will help the problem. And then ultimately there's a tension that subsides, and there's some sort of self-correction. So that's what we're coming in to provide. This doesn't obviously happen, but in terms of this problem continuing to exist, but we're looking at it. That's how we're assessing this. This is the cycle, this is the pattern that we are looking for. And so our focus is not on the content of the conversation, but on that meta conversation and the interactions that are happening. That's how we're tracking, and that's what we're interested in focusing on, of what are the dynamics that are happening in the attempts to make this problem go away. So again, just highlighting how systemic and MRI theorists view any sort of individual pathology is it's a form of communication within the system. This behavior exists as a way of maintaining some kind of homeostasis. So again, a pretty classic example of this is with children kind of being the sponges and the like sometimes like very sacrificial members of a family, where if a child is quote unquote acting out, it may be as a distraction for the tension that they're seeing between other members of the family. So it's in an attempt to distract from that tension, or recognizing that if I do this, this is one of the only times that, like, for example, my parents are on the same page about something. So I can create this unity by doing this. So I'm just going to kind of like essentially maybe overtly, maybe covertly, like kind of sacrifice myself in a way to maintain some level of calm here. So individual pathology, as it is conceptualized, conforms to, is shaped by, and shapes the relational systems in which they are expressed. So it's like this integral part of the dynamics that exist within the system. So the process of MRI, the MRI approach, is again that the presenting problem is a relational one. Specifically, it's interactional. So the problem is part of an interactional behavioral sequence, which I will talk to you about how to assess and questions to ask to learn more about that. And the attempted solution is prior unsuccessful problem solving done by the client. So again, any solutions that they've attempted are assumed to have not worked because they are in front of you right now. And the interventions are used to interrupt, but not fix the behavioral sequences, because there's not necessarily, again, we're not coming in a priori and saying, this is what a beneficial or positive or healthy, we're not putting those labels on what an interaction is, because it's specific to that system. So we're just coming in there and like figuring out how to do things differently and then allowing the system to readjust. So some questions to understand. So this is all in the assessment. These are questions that you would ask the system. So you would ask each individual person these, like there's no like spokesperson for the family, because you also want to understand what each person's unique perspective is on the problem. So you're going to ask each of them, what is the problem? Have them describe that to you. Who is this an issue for? So I know you guys can all read, but just highlighting some of the questions, like how does this problem change the behavior of the client? So again, you're asking, it's singular because you're asking each individual person this question. So are they avoiding doing something, or are they acting in a way that the client like doesn't like? Maybe are they personally acting in a way that they don't like, or is somebody else in the system acting in a way that they don't like? The other thing that I wanted to just make sure that everybody understood the terminology here is a customer or window shopper. So another thing that, seeing if there's, okay. So you also are assessing essentially buy-in by each of the individuals within the system. So a customer is someone who comes in and they're like ready to work. They've identified like motivation, they've expressed motivation, and they are interested in getting in there and essentially like allowing for you to be directive, and they're pretty compliant. And then a window shopper is somebody who's there, but is like really not interested in changing. And so you're going to put less of your effort into a place where the person doesn't want to change, and you're going to focus on the members who are more so willing to change. Because again, if the theory is, if one piece of the system changes, the rest of the system has no choice but to adjust around that change. So some questions for treatment. So again, this is where you're going to be able to gauge or get a little bit of information about a customer or window shopper status and what they think change should look like and how it should occur. You're allowing for them to be, so again, this is both MRI and Milan are influenced by postmodernism. So the idea of having the client be a collaborator in the process. So again, these are all just, questions that are specific to this approach. So you are, and as we know, many families come in and say, this person has problematic behavior. So there's generally an identified patient within the system. And this is where that taking on the family's viewpoint, at least initially, is okay, cool. Like I'll lean into this, and then I'm going to covertly and overtly change the system and the perspective on this so that there is more of a systemic view of the issue. So people generally come in and have a linear explanation for things that we as systemic thinkers know are more circular. And then finally, questions for change. So Laura, I think you were the one that talked about the like 180-degree difference, or, the opposite of something. So this would just be, again, these questions are meant to just assess the system and see about things like flexibility, rigidity, where are these points where I can insert myself and disturb. Then so the concept of reframing, I've alluded to it many times, but the definition essentially of reframing within the MRI perspective is that you are giving a equally plausible alternative explanation for why this presenting issue is occurring. So, and the plausible explanation you're giving is systemic in nature. So again, it's going back to kind of the example that I gave earlier about the acting out child and the parents having some volatility or tension between them, if the parents come in and say, our child is acting out because of bullies, I don't know, or because they are spoiled, I don't know, whatever it is, that you would frame it as, I wonder if your child is kind of sacrificing themselves, witnessing the tension that's between the two of you and really wanting to help the two of you be united. The two of you, and so this is where that benevolence kind of comes in, of this child is doing this thing for the benefit of the system, and then also assuming that the parents are doing, and you would frame it in that way, that the parents are also doing something and their intentions are benevolent for the system. So you're bringing him in because you really care about your family, and you're really wanting to figure out a way to function and interact more productively, better, more healthy, with less tension within the family. So again, the symptom is always considered relational and in an attempt to maintain homeostasis. So we are also, when you're giving these reframes, you're not expecting something to necessarily change, and you don't expect the family to just say, you're right, we agree. All that you're trying to do is have the system look at the issue differently. And so that's one of the covert techniques in this, is you're proposing a different explanation for something, and perhaps just putting it out there will make a difference in the way that the family kind of functions or interacts around it. So I alluded to this a little bit earlier about that second order cybernetics of the therapist being in the presence of the family inherently affects the family. So the observation team was really originated within MRI, where you have this one-way mirror, you have a group of people that are behind it. So as we know, kind of the farther away you get from a system, metaphorically, the clearer some of the dynamics look. So many of you may be in supervision, where you're providing supervision to a master's student or something, where the master's student, they're in the thick of it, and they may not be able to see some of the ways in which they can intervene. But as a supervisor, you're kind of, you're this emotional layer away, where you're not as emotionally escalated or anything like that. So you're able to see a little bit more clearly. That's the purpose of the observation team, is recognizing that they may be able to see this systemic dance quicker or even more completely than the therapist in there. So it's really like a reinforcement and an opportunity to consult and get some feedback on the work that you're doing. So they sit behind a one-way mirror, observe the sessions, and it's been shown to be helpful to really, this one-way mirror and the experience behind it, of really being able to help develop an individual's ability to see systemic dynamics, because they're able to just observe what's going on. So they're able to focus on the meta communication without having the pressure of intervening within it. So goals. of this approach is to have these symptom-free interaction patterns. So homeostasis is problem-free, or at least it doesn't involve facing the same problem over and over. So again, once there is no longer symptomology, and or if there's a reduction in symptomology, so the level of distress doesn't feel overwhelming to the point of needing outside help, you've done your job. So again, the problem is the attempted solution. That's the conceptualization. So your goal is to define the problem, identify what the attempted solutions were, describe a desired behavioral change, and then develop a plan. So your targeted change is the attempted solution, and the tactic of change is using the client's language. So you're labeling it the way that the client is labeling it initially for that joining piece, and then offering some systemic reframes. So you're either changing someone going to say something?
Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
concerning The goals. I know in structural therapy, we had talked about how the solution becomes self-reinforcing.
Mhm.
In this theory, is that also true? Or is it just if they see the symptom? Because it wasn't really talked about whether the solutions are sustainable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so again, with the new outlook on it, and so if the idea behind like the hypothesis of why systems function the way they do is that they are inherently self-reinforcing, so any change would be reinforced as well. So same thing applies from structural. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, for the theory worksheet, are we going to be turning in two, one for MRI and one for Milan? Or
Ooh,
combined?
good question. No, because you only have to turn in 6, right?
On the syllabus, it says there's no worksheet this week either. So there's only a worksheet on week 6. So we'd be doing 3 theories.
Oh, that's because I didn't change it. My bad. Remember when I added the week of presentations to be able to accommodate all of you, so you didn't have to have a group of 5. So you'll turn in a worksheet next week. So the worksheet will always be due the week of the student presentations, because you'll have had a week of like techniques and like this introduction, and then a week of the application of the approach. So Sarah, to answer your question, no, just one.
Okay, but then we're moving all of our theory worksheet due dates up a week.
Yes, I am so sorry for that. So was there one due on week 3?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're due every other week.
So
But
for
you
next
only have to do 6 of the 7.
So next week for week 5, you had written Haley chapters 4 to 6 too. So do you want us to do both the worksheet and reading, or should we move Haley to the next week?
Oh my goodness, what a mess. I'm so sorry. So the Haley reading should be with strategic.
Yes, so we don't do
Anytime
it.
there's a student presentation, there's no reading, only worksheets are due then. The readings are always in preparation for my presentations. I'll update that. I'm sorry, I'll work on it right after class and send you all an updated syllabus.
Okay,
But
cool. Thank you.
worksheets are always due the week of student presentations. The readings are always due in preparation for my coverage of the approach.
So if we only have to do 6 out of 7, like, could we skip our theory worksheet next week? And
Absolutely. You have
Ah,
the
okay.
choice of which one not to do.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Wait,
Okay.
Professor, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
just to double check, like,
Of
I was
course.
I was writing that down, then I heard something that sounded really good. We could choose which one to not do. So like my group presents next Tuesday.
Mhm.
I mean, just for mental sake, if we wanted to take this week off worksheet wise, that's okay since we're presenting.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Just want to double check and I heard that correctly. Thank you.
Of course, yeah. So again, I'm going to go over some interventions here. So we know about the intervention of reframing. So this is a key technique in trying to facilitate second order change if needed. Again, not always applicable. And then less of the same behavior prescriptions. So so we'll see it in a little bit. There is a paradoxical more of the same behavior prescription. It functions very differently. But with the less of the same, you're going to identify an alternative behavior that you believe will alter the pattern, and then you will prescribe that behavior where the clients leave the session with those behavioral prescriptions. So you're going to give them a different solution to their problem. But I'll talk about the more of the same. There's also the intervention or technique of utilizing the Devil's Pact. I don't really know why it's called that. Essentially what you would be doing is you demand unconditional authority. So very directive in nature before giving any sort of task. So you will give a detailed discussion so you will have a detailed discussion of the problem. So again, you're in the session, assessing, understanding what's going on, who the players are, all that kind of stuff. And then you might say something like, I can fix said problem, but you have to be willing to do everything I ask. If you do everything that I ask, it will be solved. If not, the problem remains. What is your choice? So what this is doing, because many times the way that a system may be conceptualizing an issue is just like inherently existing. So it's just this characteristic that we have to deal with. And what this is trying to do is frame it as a choice. These are behavioral choices. So you have some agency over whatever dynamic is existing within your system. There's also the technique of manipulating the system. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean like tricking them. It just means doing something differently. So you're going to alter how, when, and where the symptom appears. So each therapeutic maneuver manipulates the system a little bit differently. So they all, essentially what it's doing is, if the belief is that this, issue is omnipotent, it's all existing, by changing the when, how, and where, it allows you to look at the issue a little bit differently and as less powerful and like less all consuming. So one of the examples that I pulled was like this couple that may have that kind of this perpetual argument. So what you may prescribe to them is stepping into, plan when you're going to have this argument, go into the bathroom. One of you will sit fully clothed on the toilet and one of you will sit fully clothed in the tub. And then I want you to have the argument. So again, it's just throwing something different at this system to give them a different perspective or give them some different behavioral interactional pattern. So I'm going to describe to you each of these four. So advertising rather than concealing. So this is calling attention to the symptom in situations where power or leverage derives from its concealment. So the power is in not talking about it. So after becoming public, its presence cannot be used as a reason to avoid action. So making the covert, unstated, overt. Prescribing and scheduling the symptom, that's kind of a little bit what I was alluding to here. So you prescribe when and where to exhibit the problem behavior. Compliance implies control of the symptom. Symptom practicing, so the client will practice the behavior that categorizes the symptom. This practice implies the ability to control it. So again, making these things that feel all encompassing or out of one's control or like ever present, realizing that they do have some agency over this. Go ahead. Was someone saying something? Okay. Replacing the symptom. So you would want to replace it with another more potentially beneficial one. So a behavior similar to the system, yet somehow productive or beneficial. It's theoretically then the occurrence of the new behavior allows a perspective shift toward the problem. Trying to think of a Can someone think of an example here of replacing the symptom? So something akin to the symptom, but different in a way that may be more productive or beneficial.
I don't know if this is, because this sounds more to me like paradoxical, but at the same time, it's like, I remember we were given the example once in class where it's like, if someone's smoking, then it's like, oh, smoke a whole pack. And so it has the inverse effect.
Which that could be applicable here. Let's try to think of one that's like interactional in nature.
What about like every time this argument comes up, you stop, you don't have the argument, and you just intentionally hug or something?
Yeah, again, it's so the purpose is perturbing the system. So it is giving a different behavior, a different sequence for the family to engage in to ultimately change the overall interactional patterns.
So could it be like, say a wife is feeling like she's always doing the housework, or her husband's always off. So instead of like, whenever they come home and she cooked dinner and he eat, then they switch the roles in order to have a different transactional experience.
If that interactional pattern was causing distress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about agreeing with complaints? My wife says, "You're an idiot." And I say, "That's true. You're absolutely right." Instead of going on the defensive.
Absolutely. So MRI therapists identify a double bind, right? So you are put in a no-win situation. So this is paradoxical in nature. This is one of the more of the same prescriptions. So you are prescribing a double bind to try to undo a double bind. So using the example that I talked about earlier, where a partner demands that their partner be spontaneous. So again, if they are spontaneous, you're only being spontaneous because I asked you to. That's not true spontaneity. But if you don't care. So what the directive could be in the therapeutic double bind would say, when you are, so I want partner that is the recipient. So here I'll say husband and wife. So if the husband is the recipient of the demand, we'll say the husband is, your prescription is to initiate a new romantic behavior. So if you don't, then you are, okay, hold on, let me back up. I get confused a little, I'll be honest, I get a little confused with paradoxical things. So you may prescribe here to not be spontaneous. So if the client isn't spontaneous, then they are like leaning into therapy and they're showing some initiative in that. If they are spontaneous, then they are doing it on their own volition. Does that make sense? So you give this directive. If he follows it, he's initiating something different. But if he doesn't, he's using his wife's suggestion. So essentially he is doing that without command.
Oh, so you're basically saving his butt. So either one he chooses is going to be a positive experience for them.
Yes. So you're putting the person in a different type of double bind that is essentially the opposite of what has been expected of them. So it turns in ultimately to a win-win situation instead of a lose-lose situation.
This seems, I mean, I don't know. I feel sort of weird saying this, but this just seems so prescriptive and hard. Like you would have to be overly thinking, overly working as a therapist in this sort of theory. I could imagine that for me, I would feel taken out of the here and the now and the present and the relational aspect, but maybe that's just because I'm like that, you know, maybe there are I mean, obviously there are therapists who use this and it's effective, I'm sure. Seems like I get caught up in thinking too much about what's happening and how to figure out the opposite of a double bind and what's going on right here in the moment.
Sure. So you would feel less present in theorizing and hypothesizing and trying to think of like ways to intervene in what's going on.
Right. And maybe it's just like with anything, the more experience you have doing a certain theory, the more it becomes more natural. But right now I feel so like, wait, what? How, who, what?
Okay. Does anyone else feel that way? I want to make sure that it's not due to my like not explaining it well.
No, I think it's just the way my brain works. I'm just, I don't think it's you.
But
I think these are features of the approach. And if it fits with you personally, great. And if it doesn't, we've got other approaches.
And in general, paradoxical interventions seem pretty difficult. You better know kind of what you're doing, because that seems like there's a skill to using paradoxical interventions.
What I've always heard about paradoxical interventions is that it's you will have some level of intuition as to when it would be appropriate. So this isn't you know what, I'm not really sure what's going on. Let me throw that out there, that paradoxical interventions have like this kind of like tension. There's something like intuitive about the use of them. So there is some timing that goes into it. I'll be honest, I have personally never been in a place where I've felt like maybe so, I don't even know if like you have to necessarily feel stuck to use a paradoxical intervention. I've never felt that. I've never been at a point clinically that I thought I'm going to try to do something that really throws this system for a loop.
Well, and Jay Haley was said to be, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, George.
So Jay Haley was said to be, very fond of this technique, but that fit with his personality because he was something of a bastard. And I mean that in the nicest way.
Sure.
But that was himself. And as I was guessing earlier about Erickson, I think that as in any sort of creative process, you start with a hunch, with what fits you, and then you kind of develop it out formally. And I think that's what a lot of this stuff did. I mean, there was not any actual research that this stuff came out of.
Right.
This was some ideas that were floating around, and people were trying it on and playing with it and saying, oh, well, this is what we're doing.
Yep.
And you can too, only buy this book.
Pay us money.
I'm not sure if this is particularly aligned with this methodology, but it is uncomfortable, or at least it is for me to prescribe a symptom, to do a paradoxical intervention. The one way I've worked around it is to say, what would it be? How would you hear this? What would it be like if I were to say X? What would you think if I were to prescribe X?
So you're meta prescribing.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. So again, as we're talking about these approaches, my hope is that you're, seeing utility in some areas and being, and critiquing other areas. And what I want you to do is understand the theory in its whole. And then if there's any piece of it that makes sense to you, use it. So ultimately what I hope for all of you by the end of the semester is that you have each of these approaches in your toolbox and you feel like you have an understanding of them. And then you have the techniques if the time comes that technique makes sense to you. So just like true integration with the underlying systemic approach being kind of the driving force of how you're conceptualizing things. Okay, so I'm gonna finish up MRI and then we'll take another break. So another paradoxical approach here. Again, it's like kind of more of the same, because this is likely something that the system is already doing here. So you're going to be asking questions for the client to identify potential problems that might arise if the problem were resolved. So again, like it's kind of identifying the secondary gains of the problem. So this is not a challenging, so this isn't meant to be like directive in any way, but it's meant, again, it's one of the covert approaches in changing the perspective of the issue. So then there's the technique of restraining or going slow. So it's, again, another paradoxical intervention where you say, wait, you're changing too fast, go slower. So again, having the control over kind of the cadence of improvement would be, or change, gives the client, in theory, the belief of agency, which in this theory, they are assumed to have. So you're changing too fast, slow down. So in summary, problems are essentially behavioral, as we've identified. So the problem must be continually or repeatedly performed to exist. So a problem is something that is done, it's a choice, it's a behavior, it's not something that just is. So the performance is continuing despite efforts to end it. That is why the persistence of the problem is the central issue of this model. So the attempted solutions, that's the central issue. So the problem is here and now, interactional amongst relationships. So from early in life, we learn culturally standard solutions for culturally defined problems. Since we have learned them on an unconscious level, to question or alter the solution is very difficult. So it gives credence to the cultural and social construction of not only the behaviors, but the perception of the behaviors and the attempted solutions. So when people are stressed out, their behavior becomes less flexible, more rigid. So that's just kind of a given of the belief with MRI that we're trying to increase some flexibility through perturbing the system. People are very logical in finding a solution they think is helpful. And even when the undesired results occur, they can use further logical operations to explain why there's a discrepancy rather than revisiting the premises. So again, this is where some of that insight isn't as important for MRI therapists. They're really just looking to change the operations and not so much investigate the beliefs behind the behaviors. So clients often present their problem and attempted solution in obscure rather than clear ways. So this is why we do behavioral sequencing. This is why we make the process very overt, very explicit. Clients may also envision very grandiose, unrealizable goals. So that's another piece of the assessment. What would a solution, what would the ultimate goal be? How would we go about doing that? And then also assessing the feasibility of that. They may not only cling to solutions they see as essential, but also exert powerful influence on the therapist to take similar measures. So that kind of power struggle within that of we want you to be part of this. So, that possibility of what we would consider in other theories, triangulation or being pulled into the system. So being able to maintain that kind of clinical distance from that. And that MRI may be effective with difficult behaviors, somatic clinical problems, and organizational problems. Okay, so applicable in many different areas. So let's go ahead and take a break. I will see all of you back here at 4:24. Okay, so I'm going to change the my thought for the case study. So time permitting, we'll do like kind of a compare contrast. So I'm going to try to get through this with some time for all of you to give you, I'm going to say maybe like 20 minutes to conceptualize the same case from two different viewpoints. So let me talk about Milan. Okay, so as I stated earlier, Milan, individuals who studied at the Mental Research Institute moved or went back to Milan, Italy to kind of polish some of the
Dr. Lappin,
Yeah.
before we move on, I have one question
Oh, sure,
about
absolutely.
MRI. So I know last week you had shown us how like Aponte did it differently from Minuchin. So I'm just wondering if you had any other people doing MRI that might have a different style.
So, a different MRI so people who implemented the same approach with different styles?
Yes.
I'll have to look into that. I don't have that example readily available.
Okay, no worries. I was just wondering because yeah.
Yeah, I'll look into that because there's like 4 main players in MRI and then 4 main players in Milan. So I'll look and see what maybe some stylistic differences that there may be. Okie dokes. So, overview of Milan. So the main difference, one of the main differences between MRI and Milan, MRI is more focused on behaviors, whereas Milan is more focused on language and those communication interactions and the meaning that is made through the interactions. So I'll go over some concepts here. So also like keeping in mind that some of the concepts don't necessarily translate great from Italian to English. So like the interactional patterns were dubbed family games in Milan. And so there's the use of positive connotation to reframe any sort of symptoms or distress interactions. And the goal is shifting family interactions by shifting the family's epistemology and view of the problem. So epistemology is how we know what we know. So again, that harkens to the meaning making that is happening within the system. And so forgive me if I mispronounce this. If I do, and somebody knows how to pronounce it, feel free to correct me. The imbroglio. So this is a complex interactive process that appears to arise and develop around a specific behavior of one of the parents. So another thing with Milan is, so whereas MRI was essentially like every week a brief therapy, Milan is considered a long-term brief therapy because meetings with the family or the system were once per month, once every 6-ish weeks for about 10 sessions. So it could last a year. But again, the thought process was we're gonna unpack some of these things or identify some of these behavioral sequences in session. And because the family is the one that's going to implement the changes, we're going to give them some time in between sessions to implement them. So there wasn't any hesitation between of having sessions at a basically maximum every 4 weeks. Okay, can you guys see when I pull up a discussion here or a chat?
No.
Okay, cool. Sometimes people private message me and I don't want everyone to see it. Okay, so the focus with Milan, particularly in families, ended up being more on the parents. So again, having some, structural aspects to this of focusing the attention where the perceived power is, because in Milan, it was also theorized that some symptomology is due to some like power struggles, power imbalances. So you're going to focus on who you believe has the most power and control over the system. So it consists of bestowing a semblance of privilege and preference upon a dyadic transgenerational parent-child relationship, when in reality, this professed rapport is a sham. So this is what we would consider a coalition, like what we were learning from last week. But again, so just, I hope that doesn't become confusing, but one of the things that you'll see throughout the semester is a lot of overlap in many of the approaches that we will be talking about. So it is not grounded in genuine affection and is nothing but a strategic device used against someone else, generally the other parent. So this is what you can consider a triangulation, detouring. In Milan, it was called the imbroglio. Am I pronouncing that right, Marcy?
I think the G is silent.
The G is sort of like a Y.
Imbroglio.
Imbroglio.
Okay. Well, see, there we go.
All
right.
Who cares? I mean,
well, I learned something today. Okay. So then there is the thought of instigation. So instigation means to urge on, incite, bring about by persuasion. So again, this is like a dynamic that can be existing within a system. So someone usually instigates someone else, and it involves at least 3 people. So someone will instigate someone else against a third party. So these are just aspects of this system that are being assessed by a Milan therapist. So it's not an act or a sequence of acts, but an ongoing interactional process. That's how an instigation, or instigation, I should say, not an instigation, is conceptualized. So with Milan, I'll talk about family games on the next slide, but the family games refers to relational rules for how the family interacts. So I've heard, and maybe it's an error for me to pass this on to you. But again, I've heard kind of 2 different perspectives on family games. One is that it can be kind of interpreted as like manipulative and like trickery. So, because if you think of like games, sometimes there's this strategy that's meant to, benefit the person that's playing, you or whatever. So I've heard it both that the conceptualization is that there's some strategy, potentially some manipulation, some like more like negative interactional aspects to that. And then I've also heard that that wasn't what the originators meant. So I'm just being transparent with you in that, in my understanding of this and in my research, that there's kind of, there's not one message that's being sent about this. So the rules of these games. So again, this is just family interaction that's been dubbed within Milan family games. So these rules are not consciously created. They emerge from family interactional patterns. And this begins and is informed by family of origin. So this is even, on a more micro level, when theoretically, when a couple gets together, they create their own family game. They create their own, micro culture. So, and that's informed by their respective family of origins. So it's this established game starts immediately upon even meeting your partner, for example. So you're going to ask circular questions to assess the interactional sequence. So again, I just wanted to be transparent with you about some of my research in this and my understanding of it. So, a game, there's a group, team, there are subjects, positions, strategies, tactic, moves, skills, turn taking. So these are all thought to apply and be existing within family systems. So there's all these different affairs. There's the instigation, the threat, feint, promise, seduction. I had to look up what volte-face was. That's an abrupt and complete reversal of attitude, opinion, or position. So these are all interactional patterns that can be existing. There can be cooperation. There's also the concept or what can be seen as winning or losing, a stalemate. So the game, all of these interactional patterns within the family consist of an exchange of these concrete bits of behavior among the family members. And so here's where I, found some differing information, is that games strongly suggest the key element of strategy, which can evoke the idea of conflict in which deception is an important issue. So I'm just being transparent with that of the fact that I've read different things. So
sorry, I was just wondering if this metaphor would kind of conceptualize what you were talking about in terms of it being a game. So just like we had structural family mapping, or with Bowen, there's a genogram. Technically, you could use these strategies within a game to kind of explore the dynamics within a family.
Yes, you would not use a genogram though.
No, I don't mean a genogram, just the function of a genogram. Because like on a genogram, you have the symbols. So like, but instead of using those symbols, you could kind of use what you just said, like a group, team, subjects, while you're in session with that person to kind of map the strategy or the so-called game that's going on.
Sure. Yes, I just want to make clear that a Milan therapist would not use a genogram because they don't care about history.
Yes.
But yes, if we're like taking techniques from approaches and taking terms from each of them and seeing how they apply to others, yes, I would say that that would be applicable. So circular question, this is like the cornerstone of the Milan approach. So circular questions are they serve both as an assessment as well as an intervention. So this technique is useful when there's more than one person in the room. You can't, and I'll further explain its applicability with its non-applicability really with one person. And so this helps to assess and make overt the dynamics. So again, both MRI and Milan are wanting to make unstated, unsaid rules and interactions overt. So because you can't, if you're not aware of it, you can't change it. And this circular questions can help reframe the problem for all of the people that are in the room without verbally providing a reframe. You're just asking questions from this posture of curiosity that is not overtly challenging. It's not meant to be, but it's reframing the situation. It's like having the system reframe it for you by understanding what all the perspectives are of all of the players essentially of the game. So I don't love this graphic that I picked out for this because it's not a cycle. I just found a circle, and these are all the different types of circular questions. So you have the behavioral sequence question. So one of the things that I want to highlight with this, let's say that there is a conflict between a parent and a child, and you have 4 family members in the room. So when you are asking questions, and I'll give some examples of what behavioral sequence questions are, you're not just going to be focusing on the people that are in the conflict. So let's say it's parent A, child A that are having a disagreement, they have this conflict, and parent B and child B are not directly a part of that. You're still going to be asking parent B and child B like what they're doing while they're like witnessing this conflict. So you are still involving everybody in the sequence, even if they're not active in it. Behavioral difference questions essentially are, if parent A does it this way, how does parent B do it different? So it's just understanding how something might look different, or if, for example, let's say the example is, my mom nags me all the time to clean my room. Well, what's different about when your dad asks you to clean your room? So there might be, some sexism that's part of that or whatever. They won't get so deep into that, but it's understanding how a message from one person is received differently than a message from another person. So then there's comparing and ranking questions. You could do these scaled questions. I'll give you some examples of that. Before and after questions. So if there is this presenting issue, maybe there's this, activating event or something like that, you would want to understand relational dynamics prior to the event. So let's say, a parent is sick. They got sick, they're in the hospital. Tell me about dynamics and interactions prior to parent being in the hospital and post parent being in the hospital. So you're expanding this timeline. And then hypothetical questions of, who would be most likely to care for a sick family member? Who would be the most likely to start a fight? Something like that. So these, just getting each person's perspective on these hypotheticals gives you some understanding of where each person is. So these are, I'm not going to read these out for you, but these are examples of all of the types of circular questions that I just described to you. So Milan, like I said, is considered a long-term brief therapy. So it's about once a month for 10 to 12 sessions. So 10 to 12 sessions is considered brief, but because they are spaced out, it's considered more long-term. So in Milan, there are essentially, from what I understand, it's, what is it like in the theater, like the two masks, like tragedy and whatever. But anyway, so it's the sessions are kind of broken up like plays would be. So there's the pre-session where, again, observational team is there. So you have consultants, you have multiple people essentially giving their input on a case. So you have the pre-session where you have this consultation with multiple members of the team, and you are willingly throwing out hypotheses. But one of the things that was mentioned by one of the originators is you never marry a hypothesis. Like, you're always willing to abandon a hypothesis. So you're not rigid and stuck in that. So you have this kind of consultation, hypothesizing session, and then you go into the session. With Milan, they took breaks halfway through the session. So they have this observation team watching through a one-way mirror. If you have a 50-minute session at like the 25-minute mark, take a break, 5-10 minutes. You have this intersession where you're getting feedback from the observation team of what they're seeing, and then you're coming up with an intervention to deliver. So then you go back to the room, deliver the intervention to the family, send them on their way. And then there's a discussion so you return back to the observation team to have a discussion about like the intervention delivery and its like feasibility, how it was received, stuff like that. So there are the concepts of neutrality and multi-partiality. So neutrality is essentially this, not favoring one perspective or believing that there's one ultimate truth that one person holds. So in the notes, you can see here that one of the criticisms of the Milan approach and this stance of neutrality is that there are potentially cases that come to you in family dynamics that aren't really deserving of neutrality, where there may be instances of abuse where a stance of neutrality can potentially be seen as being complicit or even endorsing of the abuse or the neglect. So there was this critique of the appropriateness of a stance of neutrality and how there are potentially times when you have to take a stand against a dynamic that is existing within the system. So ultimately what happened was there was the adoption of the stance of multi-partiality, so the willingness to honor all perspectives, even if they conflict. So, where two people within the system have these seemingly very divergent perspectives or stances on something. So again, exceptions of, issues of violence, abuse, neglect, but saying that because of the social constructivism and that influence on this approach, that there's the possibility of having multiple realities existing within one system. So the honoring and kind of investigating and understanding each of those. So then there's the curiosity and aesthetics. So this is essentially the posture that you're taking. So I'll talk a little bit more about this because there was, when I talked about the hunter and the breeder, that the curiosity is more of the breeder role, but that it doesn't make any sense right now because I haven't talked about it yet. But essentially, because circular questioning is such a big aspect of what this approach uses, that you're constantly just curious about what is happening, what's the process like, what is the interactional pattern, and so you have this very your stance, your posture is this very sincere desire to understand everyone's perspective and allow everybody a voice, and the idea that there's no singular truth, rather there's this aesthetic curiosity of emerging patterns. So you're just really interested in what's coming of the conversation, and what are the interactional patterns that have been established in this system. There's also the I'm really short for words right now, the irreverence. I'm trying to put a noun on this concept. That's what I want to say. The concept of irreverence. So again, this was something that was critiqued about Milan of, is irreverence meaning that I'm better than, or that I'm unaffected by? So just kind of the connotation of irreverence, especially because Milan is like a language-based approach. So this is essentially what we know as that, like, emotional distance from the so this allows for some impartiality, that multi-partiality of you are establishing a relationship with the problem, and the hope is that with the concept or the stance of irreverence, that you don't get bogged down the same as the system does, of feeling like you're overwhelmed and that the problem can't be solved. So having this stance of irreverence essentially is a protective factor against feeling hopeless and helpless against the problem, and allows for you to be creative. So again, you're looking at this systemically, and you're always maintaining hope that you can help the system decrease the distress or change the interactional patterns that maintain the problem. Again, and then this irreverence is the sense that systems are inherently self-correcting. So you are maintaining openness, creativity, and flexibility. That's essentially the stance here. So just like MRI, Milan therapists acknowledge that their presence in the system inherently affects the system and in some way becomes part of the system. So that second order cybernetics. And I feel like we pretty much covered that concept. If anyone has questions, let me know, but I don't think we need to spend more time there. So Milan therapists also they give much attention to language. So again, in the belief that we have agency and that things aren't there, they aren't just are, they are done. So very similar to MRI. So again, remember, this is an offshoot of MRI, is they labeled, so the way that we talk about things shapes our reality. So for example, if you say I am depressed, so I'm sure that there's going to be some thoughts on this because it's a legitimate diagnosis, or he's an angry person, that can in this approach potentially be like almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like you lean so much into that label that your identity is defined by that. So as opposed to I am depressed, what MRI therapists would say is that this person is doing depression. They are doing anger. So making it more of a behavior and a choice as opposed to just like who this person is or their identity. So family epistemology. So this is looking at how the family punctuates events, how they define events. So looking at, again, how events are described, what do they think the cause is? What does the activating event affect? What's the order that they outline the issue with? So for example, here, again, I know I'm being gendered in this, and my apologies, is that like partner says, because my partner nags, I withdraw. And then the other partner says, well, I only nag because you're not engaging with me, so I have to. So again, very linear definition and understanding of the dynamic, but both of these fail to capture that systemic interaction, that circular causality, which is very common when couples are coming to you or families are coming to you. So when you are working on goals and setting goals as an MRI therapist, you are trying to achieve new meaning. So these punctuations are meanings that change the interactional patterns of the family. So you're trying to generate new meaning of the interactions of the behavior so that essentially the game changes. So again, same as MRI, we don't linearly, or MRI or Milan therapists, I say we, like I'm one of them, don't linearly fix any sort of family interactions. Again, they are helping to create new meaning of the interactions. And same as MRI, they're perturbing the system and encouraging it to self-correct, because again, similarly to MRI, the belief is that the family will be able to self-correct in a way that's more productive or beneficial than the attempted solutions prior. So I know I'm saying similarly a lot, but again, no a priori goals, no a priori belief of what is healthy or beneficial for the system. That's something that is co-created. And if there is any hypothesizing, any theorizing, again, this willingness to abandon it. So the goals are very simply to reduction by means of new systemic interactional patterns. So reduction of distress, reduction of problem. The family integrates the new information and alters the rules of the game. So no member has symptoms. There's like symptom-free interactions or symptom-free individuals, which are believed to be because of better interactions. And the family is able to maintain stability and cohesion as a system that is essentially defined by both the therapist and the system. So we don't have this predefined idea of what is stability, what is cohesion, that is co-defined with the system. So Milan therapists increasingly distance themselves from a normative idea of how people and families should be, moving toward observation of how they actually interact. So again, maintaining that idiosyncratic view of families and systems. So I've talked quite a bit about hypothesizing here, but here's the process. So this is that's that pre-session time. There's two phases of it. So you're hypothesizing in order to kind of conceptualize the case, but then you also hypothesize as an intervention. So this is something where you would share hypotheses with the family. Again, with that, I'll talk about it in the next few slides, but the idea of positive connotation and benevolence are a part of that. So the types of hypotheses, so you're looking at why alliances exist, what they're serving, what's going on, hypotheses about any sort of myths or premises about the family, whatever that may be, something that isn't, again, looking at multiple realities with this, but it might just be something that was maybe a story handed down that's existing within the system. And then you're hypothesizing about the analysis of communication, so that on that meta communication level. So with positive connotation, this is a reframe. It's a type of reframe, but you are framing all the behavior of each member of the family as inherently trying to benefit the system. So it's like you're always giving the benefit of the doubt to the players in the game. So again, the example that I've been using quite a bit is reframing a child's problematic behavior as a way to keep parents together. So this, having this positive connotation and this, genuine way of viewing the family, is it allows for you to take a stance of less judgment and greater hope. So I already talked about circular questions, but there's also what's called the technique of the counter paradox. So this is requesting that the family doesn't change. You're asking them to actually do the problem more, prescribe the symptom, is what I heard one of you say earlier. And so the thought is that the family will just give up, and that this has been used primarily with families and systems that have been pretty uncooperative or uncompliant, resistant. I mean, all of the labels that we put on systems. So I'm going to guess that that's probably something that people have thoughts on. Maybe not. So prescribing the symptom, asking them to do it more. Justine, potentially that could be what you were talking about with smoking. Like that would be considered a counter paradox. If you want to quit smoking, smoke a whole pack. So then there's the idea of rituals. So these are also behavioral assignments that are meant to address double binds. You always frame the assignments as experiments in Milan, and the hope is that rituals help shift meaning. So you're wanting to, so for example here, if you have a partner that is caught in the middle of their partner and child, you may prescribe them of being a partner on, odd days, and a mom or a parent on even days, and then they're able to be spontaneous on the 7th. So the purpose of the ritual is to have this dynamic and this interaction happen in a different way. So it just gives them the opportunity to look at the issue in a different way and hopefully feel like they have some agency over it. There's also the invariant prescription. So basically this just means that there was a prescription that Milan therapists used regardless of family. They just prescribed it to everybody. And the invariant prescription was to sever coalition. So whenever there was a coalition between a parent and a child, that was always seen as problematic. So again, hearkening to structural, that the executive system should be unified, should be separate, it should have a boundary. So what the prescription was that the parents would arrange a date or some kind of outing, but they don't tell the children where they're going or what they're doing or why they're doing it. So this creates a secret between the parents, and then it ends any sort of inappropriate coalition, because then the child would be able to see the parents as a separate system. And it creates a boundary between the unified parents and the child. So later waves of Milan utilized the variant prescriptions, which basically just meant that they would cater the prescription to the family. But ultimately it was about disrupting coalitions, and that was the prescription to do so. So here are the concepts of hunter and breeder. These are the positions that Milan therapists would take. So the hunter was where the therapist would look for and like pretty aggressively pursue the and track down the negative family game. So whatever negative interactions that there were, and you would directly attempt to dismantle any sort of problematic pattern and negative family game. So you are being very directive in that, pointing out what the negative interaction is and prescribing something different. The breeder was more of a indirect way, or what would be considered an MRI, a covert way of more so modeling different ways of interacting. So one's very directive, one is more indirect. So the individual competence is a presupposition of Milan. So again, families and individuals are inherently competent, inherently able. When they are requesting therapy, that's considered a move in the family game. The therapeutic game playing and the couple's stalemate, that's another concept that is looked at, or something that is assessed, like when one spouse speaks out against the other one, potentially in an inappropriate coalition with a child. And then the first step in tackling the problem is to distinguish between the stalemate, which is more covert, and the conflict situation, which is more overt. So you're looking at both of those interactional patterns. One would be considered more meta communication, and one would be that more overt communication. So unfortunately, sorry guys, we won't be able to get to the case study, but I wanted to point out some similarities and differences. So because this was originally done, this presentation, because I pulled some other things, but there is some information about strategic, but I won't spend much time on that because we'll cover that in a couple of weeks. So some differences between MRI and Milan is that they have different approach to the central theoretical constructs, interview models, and techniques. So kind of synthesizing what I've been sharing with you throughout the presentation. So MRI focuses on the interactional level, examining the sequence of behavior involved in the attempted solution, whereas Milan is based more on the cybernetic model of systems in a circuit of interaction with rigid rules maintaining the system. So change occurs through introducing new information into the system. So as opposed to tracking the behavior sequence, giving another solution, you're understanding from the Milan approach and giving new information into the system for them to self-correct. So MRI can be both direct and indirect, neutral or not, straightforward or paradoxical. Again, that concept of maneuverability, whatever is needed from the system, that's what the MRI therapist will use. And then with the Milan model, it maintains an overall position of neutrality, non-directiveness, and complementarity. So if there is a pursuer, what is needed for that is a distancer, if there's an overfunctioner or an underfunctioner. So understanding that those exist to maintain homeostasis, and regardless of the situation, there's going to keep that stance of neutrality, non-directiveness. So with acting out youth, MRI is to coach the parents in taking a one down position in relation to the youth. However, it joins with parents and gets them in charge of the young person. We didn't cover that too much here, but that's just that one down, that maneuverability. So again, coaching whatever is needed within the system. So Milan therapists will also talk to children. So I'm sorry, I think I said this backwards. Where did I say MRI focuses on the family, Milan on the parents, or something like that? I feel like I said it backwards. Anyway, Milan works with children as well to help solve problems, whereas MRI focuses more on that like parental, that executive system. Okay, thoughts, questions? I know that was a lot to cover. I just wanted to make sure that I give you the information, hopefully in a helpful way. Any comments, questions, concerns from the group? So much talking of mine.
Just to make sure for next time, we choose either MRI or Milan.
Yes, you do not have to cover both for the theory worksheet.
Okay, and no pressure, but is there any way we can get feedback for our first one?
Yes.
No. Okay.
Full pressure, I'll take it. I'll have feedback for you. My goal is Thursday to get that to you.
Thank you.
Of course. So my hope is moving forward, because we'll only cover one topic at a time or one approach at a time, that I'll be able to give you guys a case study to apply the approach. Okay, so we have Moni, George, Daniel, and Miles going next week presenting MRI Milan. All right, everyone. Thank you for listening to so much of my voice. As always, if you have any feedback for me, please don't hesitate to email me. Let me know what's going on, and I will see all of you next Tuesday. Bye, guys.